Hello and welcome to this video, which is going to discuss critical resistances. We're going to go in depth on how they work, and in the end of the video I'm going to make the case for why critical resistances are actually bad at countering something like your typical Nightblade gank build, and it's actually much better at countering something like the classical Stam Sorcerer that we see a lot currently in ESO. To understand how this works, we first have to understand how the critical resistances themselves work, and it's quite simple. Critical resistances give you 1% reduction to the enemy's critical damage modifier for every 66 critical resistance that we have. But that's also important because what we are reducing is the enemy's critical damage modifier, which means that the effect from critical resistance has a lot more to do with the enemy's build than necessarily our own. To understand how the enemy's build work, we also have to understand how critical damage works. Critical damage, like a lot of other stats in ESO, has what is called a relative decreasing returns. This is the idea that the more we build into a stat, the less we get back. And the graph for critical damage basically looks like this. You'll see that the more critical damage that you build, the less you get in terms of a percentage increase in damage. And this is very important when we are talking about critical resistances. Because critical resistances basically work by reducing the critical damage modifier, it goes the opposite direction. As you can see here by the arrows, that means that the lower the critical damage modifier is of the enemy, the more effective your critical resistance is going to be. Now this can be done in two ways, either by having a lot of critical resistance stacked on top of each other, or by the enemy starting with a lower critical damage modifier. As you can see here by the graph for the critical resistance, we imagine that we're taking someone from all the way from 125% modifier all the way down to 0. You can see that in the beginning we don't get a whole lot for our critical resistance, but as the critical damage modifier of the enemy decreases, we get more and more and more in percentage reduction of the damage. And this is the whole point. It is that the builds that have a lot of critical damage in their builds, like the Nightblade build I just showed, that would typically be above 100 critical damage modifier, and even higher, as high as above 125% critical damage modifier. These builds are very strong against critical resistance because the value of a critical resistance is very low, whereas the Sorcerer build, where it will typically have much lower critical damage modifiers, which means we get a lot more damage reduction from our critical resistances. And it's because of that lower critical damage modifier that we want to build critical resistance against the Sorcerer, but not against the Nightblade. And it's something that is valuable to consider when you're building your build. What sort of enemies am I facing, and which enemies am I struggling against? And this is where I think we have to consider in what circumstances do I actually have to make a choice. And I think the biggest choice we have in terms of choosing critical resistances versus something like typical resistances like armor is in the traits and our gear. And that is what I want to consider in this video and make a comparison on how well does critical resistances do versus a trait like reinforced versus these two different classes. So let's consider the impenetrable trait first. Of course, every impenetrable trait has a value of 127. We divide that by 66, we get about 1.92 reduction to the critical damage modifier. And we're also going to consider in this comparison that every character has a base critical resistance of 20. So if we consider the Nightblade and say that they start with 125 maximum critical damage modifier, then the reduction from this impenetrable trait is going to be about 0.94%, which is okay. But if we then compare it to the case with the Sorcerer, which is going to start with a much lower critical damage modifier of around 50%, then minus to 20%, then we see that the Sorcerer's damage is reduced by 1.5%, which is a more than 50% increase. So you get 50% more damage reduction versus the Sorcerer compared to the Nightblade. So we then move on to the reinforced trait, and I think the case that we want to make here is not, for example, the chest piece, which we're always going to make reinforced, but something like the feet or the legs in heavy, where you have a lot more flexibility and diversity in sort of the choice you can make. So let's consider here putting reinforced on, and then you would get another 388 armor, which at 21,000 armor translates to roughly 0.86% damage reduction. And this is less than the impenetrable trait on both the Nightblade and the Sorcerer, but you have to also consider here the critical chance. And this is where the Nightblade situation with the impenetrable trait is never going to be competitive with the reinforced trait. You're always going to get more damage reduction having reinforced against the Nightblade here in total, considering also the non-critical hits. But in this case of the Sorcerer, if the Sorcerer has something like 60% critical chance, the impenetrable trait is actually going to give you more damage reduction than the reinforced trait. And that is very, very significant. So and then here, I just want to talk about how this is very unintuitive. So for example, in World of Warcraft, which a lot of players moved from when they started playing ESO, the critical resistance works very differently. Instead of reducing the damage modifier, it reduces the critical chance, which means that you basically build critical resistance to a point where the enemy can no longer crit. And this meant that critical resistance was actually very good at countering things that had high critical damage modifiers. It was pretty much mandatory for tanks to hit the critical resistance cap where PvE mobs could no longer crit them. And when you then move to ESO, you have to sort of turn this mentality on its head, because the critical resistance works against another modifier. Basically, you no longer want to build it against the classes that build high critical damage modifiers. Instead, you want to build critical resistance against the ones that don't. And this takes a lot of getting used to. And that's what I hope I've clarified in this video. I hope you learned something and took something with you moving on. And that was pretty much it for this video. And thank you for watching.